Hello lovely humans, welcome to this space on the internet. This video is going to be one of the longer sort because I discovered a little funky feature on YouTube called podcasts, which is only available in the US, and I'm not even in the US, so who knows why I'm doing this, but it inspired me to do more of a podcast type video in a longer format. The month of April is about to come, and that is what we might call Autism Awareness Month or Autism Acceptance Month. And with this in mind, I wanted to create an episode detailing the history of autism since we've known it as autism. In this episode of Unpacking Neurodiversity, we'll go over the history of autism in the 20th and 21st centuries where the term first emerged. This will include an overview of the people in the Western world and Western psychology who contributed to the recognition of autism, their research, and historical events that have impacted our current understanding of autism. I want to investigate the roots of the autism diagnosis and how it has evolved over time. I will also dissect to some extent the social climate surrounding autism throughout the years, acknowledging these as the foreground for our current views of autism. To preface this video, I just want to say that I apologize for any mispronunciations of names. Feel free to correct me as best you can in the comments, and just take my pronunciation with a grain of salt, because it very well could be wrong. I am trying my utmost, though. Before beginning, I want to preface this video by saying that I will be using a lot of pathologizing language, and much of what I describe may be triggering considering the highly sanist, ableist roots of how autism has come to be. I will be going over autism during World War II and the Holocaust, so warning for that, as well as other triggering sorts of topics such as ABA therapy, and I just want to let you know in case this isn't the right time for you to be listening in on this video. If you are in a place to listen, let's get started. The neurodiversity movement stemmed most directly from autistic self-advocacy in the late 90s and early 2000s specifically. However, there's a chronology of unfortunate events preceding the neurodiversity movement that made it all too necessary for us to begin to recognize the different brains we exist with and how they intersect with social equity and inclusion. The field of psychology, like many fields, made great leaps in the 20th century. Psychology in particular, though, continues to be a relatively young science, and the 20th century saw significant growth. For the best? Who knows, but growth nonetheless. 1911 saw the first use of the term autism. Eugen Bleuler, a German psychiatrist, coined the term to refer to a trait of what he deemed to be severe cases of schizophrenia, which is a pathology that he also characterized. Derived from the Greek word autos, meaning the self, autistic individuals, according to Bleuler, were entirely absorbed in an internal focus and did not interact with or respond to the surrounding world. Bleuler speculated that this was because his autistic patients preferred to withdraw into their own fantasy worlds. This term, autism, was adopted and used by others in the field to describe this particular withdrawn trait in schizophrenic patients. In 1924 and 1925, young Dr. Grunya Sukareva described the behaviors of a group of boys as autistic or exhibiting autistic tendencies, borrowing from Eugen Bleuler's theory. Sukareva's commentary of these patients' behaviors mirrors the criteria for autism spectrum disorder that we currently have in the DSM-5. Note that she is not often credited with the discovery or first characterization of autism, as both Leo Kenner and Hans Asperger in the preceding years came to similar conclusions in their research of autistic boys. Moving on to mid-century and wartime developments on autism. During World War II, Nazi Germany and Hitler had the intention of curating a genetically superior race by way of slaughtering those who were deemed undesirable. This included autistic and disabled people. Much of the initial research on autism actually occurred during Nazi reign, during which time any legalities surrounding experimentation and ethics were minimal or absent. During the Holocaust, many previously stifled ableist ideologies were unleashed and resulted in the murder of disabled kids and adults. But it also led to increasingly harsh pathology, and killings were often made on a subjective basis of an autistic or disabled person's functioning. In a panel, some historians converged to discuss the ableism and view of autism in Nazi Germany and the Americas in World War II. I want to read a quote from Edith Schaeffer, who describes the regime as, quote, trying to create a homogeneous fascist whole. It's a fascist division of people that look and act and behave in the same ways. And in this hierarchy, there's some people who cannot be remediated. There are these children who are defective and they must be exterminated. But in this hierarchy, there are also people you can rehabilitate, and so there are different categories of worthiness and unworthiness. And in my book, I talk about the Nazi regime as a diagnosis regime, and it's this project of identifying with ever greater nuance different characteristics, and I think this is one of the reasons that autism diagnosis emerges from this period. It's looking for children with ever milder and milder defects that can then be labeled. When asked if she worried about whether the drive for fascist homogeneity was still present, Sheffer responded by questioning how, quote, a diagnosis that emerged in this collectivist vision, unquote, could be maintained in, quote, a society today that theoretically celebrates diversity, unquote. All of this emphasizes that the war laid the groundwork for the psychopathology that we have today, and the current view and implementation of psychology. Which begs the question, should we continue to use these diagnoses? To what extent can the studies of eugenicists be honored? With that, let's look at the people at work with autism in the 1940s. At this time, psychiatrists Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger, as I mentioned before, became prevalent in the discussion of autism. In 1942, Kanner wrote a paper discussing what he called infantile autism, which, unfortunately, resembles the current autism pathology we have today. Hans Asperger was known to have ties to the NSDAP, which we call the Nazi Party. As per Biomed Central's investigation of evidence of Asperger's affiliation with the Nazis, he, quote, actively cooperated with the child euthanasia program, unquote, and is directly tied to the murder of autistic and disabled children. At this point in time, autism had many labels, many of which did not matter because the purpose of identifying autism was for the sake of eliminating all that was different, regardless of what we might call it or why it might be the case. At this point in time, autism pathology only existed to then ostracize and eliminate autistic and disabled people from the gene pool. It did not come from a basis of trying to understand these people whatsoever. Let's talk about developments in the autism pathology post-World War II. In an article arguing how autism became autism, the National Library of Medicine claims that, quote, the closure of institutions for mental defectives and the growth in speech therapy services in the 1960s and 1970s encouraged new models for understanding autism in infants and children. Due in part to the early studies of autism and in part to this post-war cultural shift towards therapies, aggressive psychological behavioral interventions were administered with the hopes of curing autism, which I would argue illustrates the transition from a psychiatric focus on neurodivergent people to a psychological one, or at the very least, a shift from a focus on determining biomarkers to observing or changing behavior. This leads me to the developments of Ole Ivar Lovaas, a behavioral psychologist most famous for his studies and implementation of applied behavior analysis, or ABA therapy. To demonstrate the historical link between eugenicists of the 1940s and Lovaas's later work with ABA, in his Los Angeles Times obituary, he is said to have, quote, often said that the Nazis had sparked his interest in human behavior, unquote. A principle underlying Lovaas's work is that children can be fundamentally changed with behavioral intervention. The current neurodiversity and autism acceptance movements reject this idea, embracing that autism is natural, and we can now veer away from deficit-based and medical models of disability that claim that there is something inherently wrong with an autistic child that must be changed. Lovaas's work, from what I can tell, is the most direct source of backwards thinking that the neurodiversity and autistic acceptance movements continue to battle today. For one, ABA is embraced for its efficacy in assimilating autistic children so as to resemble their allistic peers. Lovaas is quoted as saying that, quote, you pretty much start from scratch when you work with an autistic child. You have a person in the physical sense. They have hair, a nose, a mouth, but they are not people in the psychological sense. One way to look at the job of helping autistic kids is to see it as a matter of constructing a person. You have the raw materials, but you have to build the person. Similar sentiments are expressed even now, such as Sia's affirmation of an interviewer's assertion that an autistic person, quote, might as well be like an inanimate object, like a wig. Moreover, Lovaas loved to boast about parent inclusion in the treatment process. In an interview from 1974 for Psychology Today, Lovaas responds to an interviewer asking about the parent's role in the development of autism. This interviewer asked, quote, what happened to the idea that the parents caused autism? It used to be said that some parents were schizophrenogenic, that they made their children autistic. Do they? To which Lavaz responded, no. In fact, I can tell you that the parents that we work with are very nice people. We get to know the parents as people, and when you do, you find that there's no reason to believe that they produce autism. But a lot of parents still think that it must be their fault somehow. They have heard that the parents of autistic children do not express love adequately, so they bend over backwards to be loving. What they get for their trouble is even more bizarre behavior. One strategy from which widespread beliefs about autism have spread is appealing to parents' pathos, removing any accountability from them, and focusing any hatred towards the autistic child themselves. Lavaz describes it as, quote, instead of blaming the parents, excluding them from treatment, and alienating them from their children, we bring the parents in on the treatment process. I'm assuming that this is after Lavaz took to punishing children with electric shocks, realizing that this was perhaps a tad extreme, or else I imagine we wouldn't have so many autism parents claiming that their implementation of ABA is ethical. In doing this, winning the trust of parents who had little information at their disposal and did not anticipate needing to support a disabled child, Lavaz's approach gave rise to an enormous industry of autism treatment that continues to prevail. These parents, according to Lavaz, need not accept any responsibility for supporting their autistic children according to their own self-defined needs, but could rather employ rewards and punishments in order to control their behavior, with many other parents boasting about its success. Instead of killing autistic children, behavioralists would just kill the autism in the child, as if they are separable things. This is all the same, a form of enforcing homogeneity. And I'll comment that the reason many people today prefer identity first language, autistic person, as opposed to person first language, person with autism, is because of this history. The idea that you can kill the autism in the child, that the autism is inherently separate from the person, has been an argument used to traumatize us, beat us down, and kill us. So it's not just a silly Gen Z language thing, it does come down to the history of the term. The reason autism had to be eradicated in the first place, the reason we have characterized it so negatively, is the result of fearing both neurological diversity and diversity amongst people at all. So we call it a disease. This attitude of attributing autistic people's behavior to a life-uprooting condition that would destroy both the infected child and their family gave way to viewing autism as an illness and doing our utmost to eradicate it. You see, because our only information and views surrounding autism were those of Nazis and eugenics, our attitudes continue to uphold the values of the ableist, racist, sexist, homophobic predecessors of autism research. And because children, autistic and disabled children in particular, I just want to note that the reason I'm saying autistic and disabled isn't because autistic people aren't disabled. They are part of the disabled. It's just that I think children with, say, Down syndrome would be treated in a similar way. And I want to encompass that as well. So because children, autistic and disabled children in particular, have little to no power in the adult society that handles them, people like Lavaz can harness parental desperation to propagate his principles. And honestly, behaviorists tend to be kind of creepy. This is my personal interjection, but they tend to be creepy. Take it from Lavaz, who's liked to study Nazis, apparently. But this means that in order for Lavaz to keep his research relevant, the prevailing image of autism must be parent-focused, kept out of the hands of the autistic people themselves, and deliberately targeting the family of autistic children who can only observe their child's autism as behavioral without feeling it as an internal experience. The families of autistic children are particularly prone to perceiving the difficulties that can come of supporting autistic kids without having to actually exist autistically themselves. This also circles back to the infantilization of autistic people in reducing us to, quote, severely disturbed children with a lot of very bizarre behavior. Lavaz strips autistic people of credibility and worth to those around them, and it also strips agency. The industry of autism research and treatment relies on the oppression of autistic people. This is what makes autistic self-advocacy and community today and in the past so important. This is what makes depathologizing autism so important. Which is not to say that I believe autism is not thoroughly disabling in many senses on a personal level. I mean that in the societal sense, having the dominating narrative on autism be that of a mysterious, awful disease enables the systemic oppression of autistic people. The autism diagnosis itself exists in quite the flux over the latter half of the 20th century. In the DSM-1 of 1952, the sole mention of autism was the criteria for schizophrenic reaction childhood type, where one section of the criteria briefly mentioned autism as a trait of schizophrenia. In the DSM-2, published in 1968, autism was still not its own diagnosis, but rather a part of schizophrenia childhood type. One section of the diagnostic criteria did seem to align with more modern characterizations of autism, stating, quote, "The condition may be manifested by autistic, atypical, and withdrawn behavior, failure to develop identity separate from the mother's, and general unevenness, gross immaturity, and inadequacy of development." Autism first became a diagnosis separate from schizophrenia in 1980, where it was called infantile autism. The diagnosis was defined by the following criteria. A. Onset before 30 months of age. B. Pervasive lack of responsiveness to other people. In quotes, autism. C. Gross deficits in language development. D. If speech is present, peculiar speech patterns such as immediate and delayed echolalia, metaphorical language, and pronominal reversal. E. Bizarre responses to various aspects of the environment, e.g., resistance to change, peculiar interest in or attachments to animate or inanimate objects. And F. Absence of delusions, hallucinations, loosening of associations, and incoherence, as in schizophrenia. Obviously, much of Lavaz's work preceded this distinct diagnosis, and throughout the 50s and 60s, autism was generally considered to be the result of cold parenting. Here we see the push and pull. Parents of autistic kids had been put in a place of blame for what they were told were odd, undesirable behaviors. So when the narrative of inborn autism, that which recognizes autism as present at birth or congenital, came forward, parents would obviously cling to it because of the negativeness inherent to the psychiatric view of autism. In the 1987 revision, this was renamed autistic disorder, and the criteria expanded significantly with 4 subcategories, A, B, C, and D, with enumerated traits under each category. This more closely resembles the DSM-5's criteria that we have today, as not all traits are required for a diagnosis, just a select few from each category. Here emerges the idea of autism existing on a spectrum, even if that was not the predominant thought at the time. In the 90s, a shift regarding autism commenced, with a smattering of different events. In 1998, an invalid study was published claiming that the measles, mumps, and rubella combo vaccines, or MMR vaccines, caused the development of autism in kids through the medium of an associated colitis. This paper was almost immediately defamed, and the physician behind it lost his medical license because findings could not be reproduced, and the doctor had an unstated conflict of interest. The myth persists even now, though, that vaccines cause autism, which they do not. Also in 1998, Judy Singer, a sociologist, coined the term neurodiversity, which she describes as follows. The key significance of the autism spectrum lies in its call for and anticipation of a politics of neurological diversity, or neurodiversity. The neurologically different represent a new addition to the familiar political categories of class, gender, race, and will augment the insights of the social model of disability. Singer goes even further, elaborating on how, quote, "The rise of neurodiversity takes postmodern fragmentation one step further. Just as the postmodern era sees every once too solid belief melt into air, even our most taken-for-granted assumptions that we all more or less see, feel, touch, hear, smell, and sort information in more or less the same way, unless visibly disabled, are being dissolved." Just a little mini-rambling here, but if you're unfamiliar with postmodern fragmentation, it is the philosophical idea of our postmodern age breaking previously held principles down in such a way that often emphasizes our differences in diversity, as opposed to unification under one such principle. A quote pulled from a paper on fragmentations in the postmodern explains that, quote, "Postmodernists see in this fragmentation of and from meta-narratives an end to such grand narratives, and some a liberation of discourse, experience, and self from imposed requirements of the unified centered idea, system, and culture." The idea of postmodern fragmentation can apply to much of our current social atmosphere, particularly that which surrounds sexual and gender identity, for example. In the case of disability and neurodiversity, Singer seems to have expressed a hope that the fundamental differences neurodivergent people have from neurotypical people come to be accepted as natural and worthy of widespread social acceptance. This acceptance would be not because they can be assimilated or related to by neurotypical people, but rather because of their differences. Temple Grandin was also a significant voice around this time in the 90s when it came to autism awareness. Grandin herself is autistic, and her philosophies surrounding autism were notable because they were coming from the perspective of an autistic person, not psychiatrists or parents of autistic kids. However, much of her work is based on the idea that autism exists on a spectrum of mild to severe, and those with mild autism should be challenged because they may be the next Einstein. This, of course, is coming from a woman who couldn't speak until she was 3 and went on to invent a cattle farming technology which was widely adopted throughout the US and Canada. Her story and the subsequent narrative she preaches are examples of what we call inspiration porn, which I think is one of the reasons that she is a bigger name in terms of autism advocacy. Inspiration porn denotes the portrayal of disabled people in such a way that makes abled people feel better about themselves, usually through detailing the perseverance of disabled people and their successes. I would also argue that a lot of Grandin's work is also the source of some Aspie supremacy, which is another community-specific term but refers to when those with lower support needs and perhaps less social and occupational barriers, in other words, those who would have been diagnosed with Asperger's in the previous versions of the DSM, hold a sense of superiority over autistic people unlike themselves and are a source of ableism to these autistics. I want to emphasize that Grandin's experience of success in the holistic world as an autistic person is great for her, and that's awesome. But the ways in which she has projected similar narratives onto others is, in my opinion, questionable. Like, our worth shouldn't be defined by how much we can succeed within holistic standards, which is kind of what it seems like she's doing, and who can blame her if she's being praised by holistic people because of the fact that they feel better about themselves and not needing to accommodate when autistic people themselves will challenge themselves and push themselves through it if they are able. At this particular time, the 1994 DSM-4's autistic disorder and its revision published in 2000 featured slightly more refined criteria that nearly mirror the DSM-5's autism spectrum disorder. At this time is one of 5 pervasive developmental disorders, including autistic disorder, Asperger's syndrome, child disintegrative disorder, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, and Rett syndrome. Extending back from the establishment of autism as a disease, in the early 2000s, we see the rise of organizations like Autism Speaks, seeking a cure for autism. Autism Speaks, in particular, was literally founded on the basis of finding a cure for one couple's autistic grandson. They were apparently disappointed to find out that there was no existing cure, and resolved to find one themselves. This organization reaps in ridiculous sums of money, likely because of the narrative surrounding autism that it's terrible and families are burdened by it, so celebrities love to give money to places like Autism Speaks, most of which is allotted more so for the sake of profit and investigating autism cures and prenatal testing than anything else. They also contribute enormously to fear-mongering around autism. One such example is their controversial public service announcement called I Am Autism, where autism is portrayed as a monster out to destroy people's lives. I will read an excerpt. I work faster than pediatric AIDS, cancer, and diabetes combined. And if you're happily married, I will make sure your marriage fails. Your money will fall into my hands, and I will bankrupt you for my own self-gain. I don't sleep, so I make sure you don't either. I will make it virtually impossible for your family to easily attend a temple, birthday party, or public park without a struggle, without embarrassment, without pain. You have no cure for me. Your scientists don't have the resources, and I relish in their desperation. Your neighbors are happier to pretend that I don't exist, of course, until it's their child. I am autism. I have no interest in right or wrong. I derive great pleasure out of your loneliness. I will fight to take away your hope. I will plot to rob you of your children and your dreams. And the truth is, I am still winning, and you are still scared. And you should be. I am autism. You ignored me. That was a mistake. And the remainder of the commercial depicts the rising up of all families affected by autism to basically kill this disease. Even now, most people probably don't see the problem associated with the intent of curing autism, especially if it makes the lives of carers and autistic people themselves easier. However, for one, making an autistic person holistic is impossible, and getting rid of the autism in them is called killing them, because autism is inherent to how you are and how your brain works. And secondly, curing autism is another way of eliminating diversity. It is another way of creating homogeneity of people and perception and behavior and ways of life. It clearly mirrors the efforts of Hitler and Nazi Germany. The ways in which autistic people are demonized makes it easier to imagine and accept their genocide. The gassing and incineration of disabled people in the late 30s was common knowledge to some extent, and permitted by the fact that people came to see these disabled people as disposable, and a threat to the purity of the gene pool, so to speak. Moving on to modern autistic self-advocacy, which will all but conclude our little sesh here, I'll say that despite the negative history of the autism pathology and the treatment of autistic people, we've established a counter-movement that continues to expand. I already mentioned Judy Singer's proposition of neurodiversity. This was one foundation on which autistic voices have been amplified. In online spaces beginning in the 2000s, autistic people could communicate with one another and form a community. And I will be the first to entirely denounce psychology, the entire field. It's outdated, it's discriminatory, it's ableist, sanist, racist, sexist. In terms of autism, our diagnostic assessments to rely on now out-of-date diagnostic indicators such as imaginative play, which is not actually necessary characteristic of autism. College-level psychology courses still use Rain Man as an example of what autism looks like. Our diagnostic measures still reflect young white boys from families of money who had the privilege of seeing a psychiatrist in the early 1900s, as does most research we have to this day in psychology. However, a shift has commenced. Recently, studies have begun to suggest that autistic girls outnumber autistic boys 4-3, rather than the 1-4 ratio of girls to boys that still makes common appearances on websites and resources dedicated to autism. Chloe Hayden recently starred in Netflix's Heartbreak High as a canonically autistic character. In the DSM-5, masking was added as a consideration to make when diagnosing autism, which means girls, women, AFAB individuals, and people of color who are more likely to use compensatory strategies to mask their autistic traits may receive an autism diagnosis, where before it would have been a cluster B personality disorder, anxiety disorder, depression, or some combination. Through increased social media platform usage has come increased recognition of autism, and many autistic and otherwise neurodivergent people have taken to internet advocacy and education. Obviously, there is yet a long way to go, and many more improvements in our world's understanding and acceptance of autism to come. Hopefully, we will see the fall of charities and organizations who drive scientific research on the genetic basis of autism, who want to exterminate autistic people. Hopefully, workplaces will be more prone to accommodating, and children in schools will be slower to bully autistic kids. Hopefully, every autistic person will have a sense of autonomy regardless of how much support they require, and no autistic person will be abused or murdered by their caretaker. Hopefully, autistic children will be allowed to communicate and self-regulate in the ways they need without being penalized or judged. Hopefully, populations long oppressed and forgotten by the psychology field will receive adequate support, and diagnosis will expand to include different presentations of autism. And hopefully, if nothing else, we'll stop trying to fucking cure autism. So if you made it to the end, congrats, this is the end of my mini episode on the history of the pathology of autism and the importance of autistic self-advocacy. I know it's a kind of a hefty one with a lot of pessimism, I suppose. I don't think it's pessimism because it's concrete, it's just horrible. It's not even pessimistic to think that it's terrible, it just is terrible. But it is a terrible history. I don't think that the message of this episode is terrible though, because the fact that we've had such a negative history at least inclines me more than ever to want to see a more positive one going forward. And I should hope you feel the same. So thank you for listening in or watching in, and we'll see you next time in this space on the internet. Bye.